Hello friends of .NET, I'm Emil Landworth and you can find me on Twitter at TerraJobst. So today's episode is kind of interesting because I've never done this before. Normally I have some sort of baked plan of what I want to do. Today I have a somewhat baked idea of what I could do. So I have a few proposals that we can, I guess, vote on and then decide where we want to take this. So in fact, let me actually start the polling right now. So there are a few things. And so the two things that I think could be interesting. Let me first start the poll here. New poll. What should I work on? And there's basically two things. We can either do commons and trivia, which is basically a way to store white space and comments in the syntax tree. And then the other one is nullable reference types. And I have to dampen your expectations. You're not going to implement nullable reference types for our language. What we are going to do is change our compiler to actually use C# nullable reference types in our compiler, right? Because that's the kind of thing we want to do. And so where did the poll go? I thought the poll is supposed to show up on my screen, which right now it clearly does not. Let me see what's going on here. Are you guys even able to see the poll? Let's start with that. So can you guys see the poll at all? Does it show up anywhere? Something is weird. So I tested this yesterday and now it seems to show up. Somebody managed to vote somehow. That is very weird. Well, just let me see in the comments then what you prefer. Like, do you prefer us working on nullable reference types or comments and trivia? Toss a coin. Good idea. I don't have any coins. It is rather weird. Only a single person voted. 2 people voted. Yeah, sometimes I'm not entirely sure what happens. So what I can tell by the what I see in the comments, it seems like the majority of you seems to prefer comments. So let's go with comments then. So before we do that, typical thing, let's jump into the code and let's look at some PRs that we have. Interesting. It's always fun, right? I'm sitting there in the evening thinking, here's some PRs that I should probably merge tomorrow, and then by the time it's tomorrow, there's more PRs showing up, and I really like that. All right, let's talk about these two here, and then let's talk about this guy, this guy, this guy, and then this guy. So Nirmal added three things basically. They're all kind of cleanup-ish. We have an editor config in the root now. We have removed all the BOM from the files, which I actually also like, and I think at some point I did that even, but then they always sneak back in, it seems. And then he reformatted the code to follow the style guide that he added. And as far as I can tell, the style guide is mostly in alignment with what we already do. Of course, once you do these kind of things, there's always a lot of churn. So I'm inclined to take this because I like consistency. There's a few minor things I don't like, but it's not a biggie. So for example, I generally prefer showing, when it comes to reference groups, I usually go from, I guess, most external to least external. So I usually start with package references, then normal references, framework references and stuff, and then project references, but it doesn't really matter. I can easily fix this next time we do this. And then of course, always fun to and churn here, but I think all I like cleanup. So let's take this guy. Hopefully that did not result in massive conflicts. Alright, so now here's the other interesting one. So I did some thinking whether I will like it or not. So our REPL right now, the way I implemented this is when you have a blank line, I effectively just exit. Versus in this case, he just changed it to say, do nothing, just keep going. Which sometimes is useful when you just want to push stuff further down on the screen, so you have some visual separation between different submissions or different parts of your submission, which is actually quite nice. So, and then most other REPLs do the same thing, where you have to basically say, some version of exit in order to quit. So I'm not sure I will like it, but it seems like an interesting idea. So let's see whether we actually like that when we actually use our REPL. Can always undo it later. Sure, that works. File renamed. No, I see. Yeah, that makes sense. Interesting, this also goes in the 22 branch. Return Parse Diagnostics before emitting. Yeah, so that's one thing we need to fix in general. I don't like how we do diagnostics right now. Yes, we should not do that probably. Also, I was under the impression that global diagnostics already contains our Parse diagnostics. Is that actually not the case? So I thought the global scope so we bind the global scope, doesn't seem like we are looking at diagnostics ever here, do we? It doesn't seem like it, and then I think bind functions. I guess it's not bind functions, it's bind program, right? Yes. Yeah, as I said, I'm not a fan of how we do diagnostics right now. We need to make this in a way that they cleanly accumulate, which right now they do not. Use computed constant values. Nice. Nice. I like it. That's very clean. Yeah, so the idea here is that, in the last episode we added the ability to emit constant expressions, or not emit, compute them, but we didn't change the emitter ability to use them. We only used them to determine dead code. And that's actually kind of, probably should have done this in the episode, but I actually like this a lot. So this is, it's very clean. And then of course this is unreachable because it's handled by this one here. I like it. So I would say in principle, yes, we should rewrite them just for consistency. All right. Now we're done to this. So it seems like the overwhelming majority was comments. So let's not do library reference types today. I will definitely do that. So let's quickly talk about what the problem here really is. So today, first of all, we don't support comments at all, which is super annoying. Comments are not that hard in the current version that we have. I will probably do this first. The general idea is you would just change the lexer effectively to detect comments, and then the parser will, similar to whitespace, just filter them out at the beginning. That will be pretty straightforward. The only thing that's a bit more tricky with comments is, we have single line comments, right? They're pretty straightforward. And then we have multi-line comments, right? So basically this form here, which you probably also want to support. And they're not more difficult per se in the lexer. That's still the same kind of logic. But the thing we need to make sure is that when we actually render them in the REPL, our REPL does syntax colorization, and when you have multi-line comments, and you modify earlier lines, you might have to recolorize the entire document, right? So we need to make sure that that also happens. Again, that shouldn't be rocket science either, but we need to do it. Then when it comes to the general idea of comments is that, white space you can probably drop on the floor in the syntax tree and nothing bad really happens for the most part, because you already have the positions. So you account for white space by the fact that, your keyword starts at a particular position, which includes indentation and other stuff. It makes other things a little bit harder, like when you rewrite the syntax tree, for example, or if you want to take the syntax tree and write it back into a form that matches the input. If you drop white space on the floor, then it gets tricky to replicate that, right? So for example, you can have tabs and spaces, and one space or one tab would have the same position change, so you can't truthfully replicate the input unless you record white space somehow in the syntax tree. Of course, you could go ahead and use the syntax tree in conjunction with the input, but that defeats the purpose, right? At that point, you might as well just use the input. The point of using the syntax tree is that you can rewrite the tree and then write the tree back, right? So you can effectively define rewriting of the syntax, a code refactoring, as modifications or more changes over the tree. Comments is slightly different because comments can actually contain data that you want to have later. So for example, this person here had this idea that in front of a function declaration you wanna put / comments, and then everything that you type in there would be the summary of that function declaration, right? So similar how we do it in C# when you have the summary tag and the exception tag and the return tag and so on and so forth, right? So how would that work if we don't actually expose them? Again, you could imagine that somehow you go back to the input file and extract comments, right? But that's a lot of work. The other idea that he had was, well, let's actually make the / comments part of the syntax, and then in the parser change that. That's unfortunately not great. That works for very simple cases, but it gets complicated fast. So when you think of comments, for example, comments can appear literally everywhere, right? So let's say you do / comments for the function. Awesome. But now you also want to do them for the parameter. Okay, then where can they appear, right? They can appear in front of the thing on the previous line. They can appear after. So maybe you want to support this style here for commenting parameters as well. And now you have to handle them freaking everywhere in your syntax, right? And that gets annoying fast. It also gets more complicated in the syntax tree because now you have to, think of creative ways to expose them. And, if you think just of a binary expression, A plus B, well, comments can appear before the first argument, after the first argument, before the plus, after the plus. And then there's spaces in between and all of that. So it's not necessarily easy how to do that. The way Roslyn has done it is, I think, ingeniously clever. So the way they have done it is they said, well, we record all of the stuff, comments and white spaces, truthfully with the input. But in order to make our lives easier, we don't put them in the syntax tree. We put them in the tokens themselves. So each token has leading and trailing trivia. Leading trivia is effectively everything that's before, potentially going across multiple lines. Trailing trivia is everything that goes to the next line. So in other words, this comment here is trailing trivia for X, but comment 8 is no longer trailing for X because there's a line break. So this comment here is leading trivia for the open brace. For the close brace. And that's basically to match your intuition, right? Usually when you put a comment, you're commenting the next line. The only exception are actually comments like this that you put on the same line. They usually refer to things that are to the left of that, right? And you might say, well, associating this comment here with this comma here seems completely weird because it's really with the parameter. that is true, but that is kind of like a thing that you can't really easily differentiate, right? But if you think of your syntax tree, it's not really a biggie if you associate it with the comma, because that's relatively easy to figure out. But for the most part, it's just relatively clean, right? So for example, the function declaration is effectively, the function declaration is a syntax node. You can trivially ask the syntax node, what is your first token? And then you can just say, give me the first token's leading trivia. And that's now the documentation comment for my function declaration, right? So imagine you have different keywords here. You have member and function and whatever. You don't even have to look for those. You can just ask, what is the first token that you actually have in your node? And then you ask for its leading trivia. So that's actually quite nice. The other thing we can do with trivia is, white space and comments are clearly trivia, but there's other cases of trivia. So for example, in C#, you have the preprocessor, right? Pound if some condition. That's also trivia. So basically all the parts that are disabled are trivia because they are in the syntax tree, but they are not actually relevant for the parser. So they're all effectively part of the previous token as disabled token trivia or something like that, right? Or disabled text, I think it's called, because they're not even tokenizing them. And so that's a way we can do it. The other thing that C# does is when the parser encounters problems and has to skip tokens, the tokens are also not dropped on the floor. The tokens are also included in the syntax tree as trivia for the corresponding token, as skip token trivia. So basically everything that we have in the input file, we can actually make sure appears in the syntax tree. And that's kind of the goal of trivia. So implementing trivia is not super hard. Dealing with it later might. So even though it's very cleanly done in Roslyn, where it's effectively part of the tokens, which means for the most part you don't even see them, as soon as you make modifications to the code, usually when I implemented Roslyn refactorings, it takes you 10 minutes to write the refactoring and then an hour and a half to test your refactorings with all the permutations of white spaces and comments and make sure that you preserve them in the way you intend. So even though they're still cleanly mapped in the tree, they're not necessarily easy to deal with. Or as the Roslyn team jokes, trivia is not trivial. So there is that. Yeah, so all right, so one person is asking, do you have a list of the previous videos? Yes, if you go to the URL minsk-compiler.net, that points you to the YouTube playlist where there's all the previous episodes recorded. All right, so let's start. You can check out -B episode 23. Actually, let's pull first. No trivia was harmed in the making of this video. I can't guarantee that. In fact, this episode might involve some and some more, and maybe even some. So we'll see. We will see. All right, so let's go first. If you want to add comments, let's go to our Lexer. So let's start with comments. Where should I put them? Well, I guess we already have a slash in there somewhere here, right? So if if look ahead is slash, then we say read single line comment. Else if look ahead is star, then we say read multiline comment. Right, that seems about right. So let's generate these guys. And then let's also decide, yeah, I need to stop these notifications now. Otherwise this is going to be annoying. Quit Telegram. All right, so let me quickly look at the outline here to actually see what we have done in terms of sorting. We have read string, read whitespace, read number, read identifier or keyword. So it's a bit unfortunate. I will probably want to organize them slightly differently. Yeah, let's put them here for now. So single line comments are easy. So the way we do all this stuff here is we basically have a while loop. And then at the end, I think we assign the token kind. So we do the same thing here. I guess we have to make a decision whether we want to return the text right now or the value. But I don't think we would say that our comments have values for now. We'll just return them as the text. So the most important thing is kind is syntax kind single line comment token. And then we do the same thing here, and we call this the multiline. The multiline comment token, right? Alright, let's move them somewhere sensible. Maybe before the whitespace token. Maybe after the whitespace token. That seems about right. So what do we do here? We say while true, switch current. So what do we have here? We have case. That means the zero terminator means we read too far. Actually, no, it doesn't mean that. So those are all terminators. Now the thing is, they're not actually part of the comment. Which means we will have to say if the look ahead is that. Okay, so let's say position plus equals 2, skip leading slashes. So the funny thing is, I think we do have an end of line trivia, right? End of line. We have end of file token. Yeah, I guess we return this as whitespace token. So probably eventually we also want to have a line break token, which we don't do right now, right? Do we do anything like this right now? No, we just say anything that is white space, read white space. That also works. Yeah, so I think I will only skip one. So that we are making sure that we always look at the correct one. Because if I do two, that would mean that a single line comment that is effectively like this, we would now look at the, like we are already standing on the line break at that point. Which is fine, I guess. Yeah, I guess we can still say current is this, so long we remember. Let's start with that. Maybe that's already doing it. Because I think I can, if I at this point say I'm done, and I don't consume any further, then that's also fine. Done equals true. And then it probably would help if we check that. And then it would probably help if we increase our position. Oopsie daisy. That seems about right. Shouldn't single line comment token be called single line comment trivia, as it's not a token but associated with one? Yes, eventually we will do that, but we have to do this for other as well. So right now I will just do one commit where we just add single line comments and multi-line comments, and another one where we actually introduce trivia. So one step at a time. So this seems right to me. Yeah, let's do one commit at a time, so we don't overcommit here. So let's start with single line comments because they're probably easier to do. So now we have that. Now in our yeah, where is this actually happening here? Where is our syntax highlighting happening? Here, right? So we can say var is comment, and we say this is just token kind, syntax kind, comma, not comma, comment token, single line comment token. Yeah, let's remove this guy as well. And then we can say else if is comment something something green. And then I think we also need to change our parser, because right now we filter them out, right? Like this. Single line comment token. So this should already be part of it. Let's just run interactive and see. No, not this one. No. So if I say this is a comment, yeah, sequence contains no elements. What happened here? Is complete submission. Yeah, see, that's an interesting case right now. So we're saying exclude the len enter file token, but if we do that, then clearly we can have a case where we don't have any, right? So last member, last or default. So we are complete if we say we have no last member or last member is missing. That's when we're incomplete, right? Right, so this already works like a charm. So if I say function do it int return 1 plus 3 compute number, something else, right? This is doing what we expected will do. All right, so far we have done comments, which I guess is a reason to celebrate. At least we have done single line comments. Oh yeah, now I have to actually exit. Now we find out whether I like this or not. Muscle memory. All right, so let's start with this. And we say add support for single line comments. Let's say GitHub PR create I guess I want to create a draft PR though. So that would be episode 23 comments and trivia. All right, so we have that. Now let's think about multi-line comments. So they will work similarly. So let's fix this guy here immediately. So if it's single line or multi-line, then let's fix the lexer. Else if star read multi-line. So we have multi-line, and then I think this will work very similarly. So I mean, ordering wise, Probably should have done that, right? So if you see end of file, that means wasn't terminated. So we probably want something that looks like this. Right? We can say report unterminated multi-line comment. Line breaks mean nothing to us now. And then we can say if we see a star, then we can say if look ahead is a slash, then we can say done equals true. I guess we have to say position we can also do this, right? Will probably equally work. All right, so now we can do, let's report this guy. Which will probably look very similar. Unterminated multi-line comment. So I think that's everything we need to make it work functionally. It will probably not work. I mean, it will definitely not work for rendering, but it should at least work functionally. So let's see. This is a comment. Right, so this works. As we can tell, the rendering does not look like it should, but at least functionally, this thing does what we expect it to. Yeah, unterminated multi-line comment. That is kind of what we would expect. It's a bit weird that we set the range to 1. We should probably set the range to 2 here. Not that it matters a great deal, but it seems it's a bit more intuitive. Aesthetically, that is. Yeah. All right, so then this does what we expect it to. Now let's talk about rendering. Any questions so far, by the way? Doesn't seem like it. All right, so so the rendering here So right now what we do here is we do token by token, right? So we basically say we parse the entire line and then we go token by token. This doesn't work for us anymore because if we do that, this is effectively why this looks like garbage here, because we are rendering line by line, right? So when this line starts, it's all a comment, that's fine. And then when we get this line, well, there's nothing, so we parse this effectively as a sequence of identifiers. So how would we know that we are currently in a comment if we parse line by line? And there's effectively 2 ways of doing that, I guess. One is we can say, well, how about we track additional state that we carry from line to line? And that state could be all the tokens, like the entire document tokenized, right? So that means that when we call render line the first time, then we basically render the entirety of the document. And then afterwards, we just deal with the particular line. So what we can do is look at our REPL here. So we've done our REPL basically in a way where we separate the concerns. So we have this base class here, which is language agnostic, which just deals with the mechanics of a REPL window. And this is where we have our, what is that, render, our line renderer. So basically the idea is that when you construct this guy, you can specify what your line renderer is. Which in our case, I think we just have a virtual method somewhere. Alright, so ignoring these guys here. There is a, where is it, render line. Which basically by default just renders the line. So we should probably change this method signature. So the idea is that we, instead of giving you just the line, how about I give you the iRead-only list of lines. I also give you the line index that is supposed to render, and I give you some state, object state, and this guy can return some state. So the idea here is that effectively if line index is 0, we compute some state that we return, and then when we reach line number 2, we can extract the state from this thing, because this guy is basically passing on the state. So that's a very common pattern that you have in syntax highlighters, and this way you can effectively track that you have to re-render the previous that you basically are outside of a comment. So it would be just line index, right? So what's your problem now? Oh, return state. All right, so now we have to change this guy here, and we call this private delegate line and a handler, which is an object iRead-only list lines int line index object state, something like this, right? And then we can replace our string here with this guy. Which means everything works except for the invocation. So the submission document, we can pass in the submission document and the line, and let's pass in null for now. So, oh sorry, not line, it would be line count, right? Line count will be the current line. It's a bit that we call it line count. Okay, so now let's call this var state. Is object null. And then we just do this. Why state is object and not strongly typed? Yeah, so the idea here is that we want to keep our REPL independent of the Minsk REPL, right? So effectively the idea is that this guy here has no idea what language we are basically parsing. or providing the REPL for, right? It's just kind of separation of concerns. And so this code here literally doesn't care what the type is, right? This code just says, well, the line renderer is responsible for rendering a line. The line renderer can carry on state between lines. And so I don't care what state that is, I just pass it on, right? You give me the state and I give it back to you. Right, that's basically the contract of this method. And then this guy here can say, well, render line. And then we say we have an iRead only list of string lines, int line index, object state. And then we can say var, yeah, let's just do this for now, lines, line index. And then we just say return state for now. So what we will do now is we say if state is null, then we do the following. Then we parse the entirety of this thing. Actually, we need the source text. No, we don't need the source text per se. Or do we have a way to... So how do we parse tokens right now? We just say syntax tree parse tokens. And we can give the source text. Perfect. All right, so then let's give it the source text. And then this guy is what? An immutable array of syntax token. Perfect, good enough. Tokens is this, and then we say state equals tokens. Else we say I guess we need to do this immutable array syntax token tokens. Right? What exactly is your problem? Oh, okay, fine, be like that. So now basically what will happen is the first line that we render, we take the entirety of all the lines, tokenize the entirety, which now makes sense that we are now able to tell that the second line is in the comment context because we consider the entire context of the document. And so now we have a token array that has the entirety of the document, right? Now, of course, for rendering purposes, now we can't just output all the tokens. That would be a bit bad. We now have to say, well, only output the tokens that are on the current line. And how do we do that? Well, I guess, come to think of it, we want the, yeah, let's actually do something clever here. So let's say private, unfortunately we have to now build another class, private sealed class. Let's call this RenderState. And the RenderState basically takes two things here. It takes our source text and our immutable array of syntax tokens. I mean, I could have done, oh, I guess that's why my syntax highlighter is not happy. Right, let's do this. Let's call this RenderState. Also avoids the boxing issues. Alright, so now we say we have these tokens, and then we say this is new RenderState for source text and tokens. And now we can say RenderState tokens, right? That works. Now, how do we know what token is on the line? Well, the good thing is we know the line, right? So we can just say no line is RenderState source text line index. What does this guy give me? Okay, that's not what we want. Get line by index, so lines, yeah, so lines, line index. And then we can say this is the, we render the line break? No, we just say span. So this is our line span. So now we know for the line that we're supposed to render, what is its span? And now effectively all we have to do is we just have to say, well, if the token is intersecting with that line, then we can, so basically if token span, don't have an overlap method, that is unfortunate, overlaps with line span, or I guess if line span overlaps with token.span, I guess if not, we can just say continue. Alright, so now we have one of those methods that always take me way too long to write. But I think I now know how to do it. So basically what we have to do here is we have to determine whether the span that we are given overlaps with this guy, right? And so let me just visualize what this looks like. So we can have this situation. Right, this is let's call this case 1. Let's call this case 2. Case 3, case 4. So that is one case. That is another case. That is one more case. And then we have this case here. I guess we have one more. 5, 6, 5, 6. The other way around, right? Right, so We can overlap at the beginning, we can overlap at the end. We can be fully contained. The other thing can be fully containing us. We can be before or we can be after, right? So these are effectively the things I can think of. And so the idea would be that we check for all these conditions and then return true or false. And I think it's not that hard. Effectively what we have to compare is this guy in relationship to this guy, and then this guy in relationship to this guy. So we are overlapping if start is before the other end and our end, is it like this? So start is less than end. Start is less than end, yes. Start is less than end. Start is less than end. Start is less than end, yes, but that doesn't matter really. Yeah, what is that? Start is less than end, and then we have this guy here, which is larger than this start, right? And end is does that sound right? I think something like that. Right, so because now we basically say, so this start here is less than this end, and this end is larger than this start. So we would return true for this. This start is less than this end, and this end is larger than this one, so we would return true for this one. This is less than this. This is larger than this. It also return true for this one. This guy is less than this guy. And this guy is larger than this guy. So it would return true for this one as well. This guy is less than this. But this guy is not larger than this guy. So we would return false for this. And then this guy is not less than this, so we would also return false for this. So I think this is the correct condition. Something like that. All right, so far so good. Now we find the right tokens, but still don't render it correctly because you also have to slice the text. So we can't just say token text here, because for a multi-line comment we have to basically only look at the one that is on the current line. So we have to say token start is the maximum of token span start and line start. Right, and then we say token end is the minimum of token end and line end. And then we say token span is text span from bounds token start token end, and then we can say token text is, I guess we can just say render state text awesome token span. Well, let's see. What is the extension I have above GitHub? Not entirely sure what you mean. This guy here? That is just references. I think the reason it shows up is because I did a search at some point. Maybe that icon is new. Maybe that's new because I'm on, I think this is the dogfood build of Visual Studio. So maybe this hasn't shipped yet. All right, so now let's see what's happening here. So when I say /star foo, so it's all green, it's all green, it's all green, stops being green. All right, so that seems reasonable. Now we can say 1 + 2. Okay, maybe not like that. Maybe that works as well. And if I do this, everything also unhighlights the way we expect it to. Right, so now we get the correct behavior here, and that also works. I think I like the #exit. I just I'm not used to it. All right, so this is this. Something like that. So does this make sense to people, or did I jump too far ahead? Should overlaps with have equality on both conditions for symmetry? No, you're too late now. We've already worked it out. Chat is smart. Okay. So the question is, I guess the condition here. This is what under token, right? No text span. So yeah, so this is an interesting question, right? So generally speaking, the way we represent spans is we think of the end position as not inclusive, right? We think of this as if you think of it from this point of view, right? Text spans are effectively, I guess, A, B, C plus, right? So think of this text here, right? The text ABC followed by plus, right? So if you were to tokenize this, we have one token span that is covering ABC, and we have another token span that represents plus, right? So the problem is the end position here, like, you know, the closing brace here and the starting brace here, if you will, are the same character, right? Because they're, you know, they're logical positions, right? And so, because we can't actually put something in between characters, right? And so the end position here is the start position of this guy. That's why the end position is not inclusive, right? Because if you do the math, the length of this thing is 3, right? The starting index is 0, right? And so the end position must be 0 plus 3, but that's the 4th character, right? And so that's why we generally think of the end position as not inclusive and the start position as inclusive, right? So now the question is this still correct though? So we say start is less than end. So basically, I guess the question for overlaps is, if you have two things that touch each other, are they considered overlapping? And I think for our purposes, the answer would be no. So start less than end makes sense. So I guess it needs to be larger than span start. Oh, does it? Hold on. Right, if we have... So end is... So are they considered overlapping? Right, start is less than this guy, but end needs to be larger than this, right? So we would say this is not overlapping. This would be overlapping. So that would mean like this. Right? So I think that's right. Add support for multi-line comments. So I think our tests will now fail. They probably already have failed before. They're all using the new Microsoft font. Yes, use Cascadia. Cascadia is an amazing font. I like it a lot. Maybe a quick summary of the changes would be helpful too. Yeah, I can do that. But first let me fix the tests here. So the reason our tests are failing is because we don't test. So first of all, why these guys are failing here is because we have a test that permutates all tokens in sequence, so that we can see that when stuff doesn't work. So we create these token pairs. However, we need to exclude certain token pairs because they cannot appear close to each other. So for example, if we put two slash tokens next to each other, they no longer parse as two slash tokens, they parse as one common token, right? So we basically have to do what we did here before. Question is, where should this guy go? At the end is probably fine. So if they're both slash tokens, slash slash, then what does true mean here? Require separator, yes. So that would not work, right? And then slash star will also not work, because this is a comment and this is a multi-line comment, right? We don't have to say star slash, because star slash outside of a comment will just parse as star and slash. So this should fix 2 of the 3 test failures. Yes, and now we just get an error for it didn't cover all the tokens in your tests. Which is probably true. So basically what we are doing here is we're saying, I think get tokens is the method that determines. Yeah, how do we know whether we tested all token? Covers all tokens, so give me everything that has keyword or token in it. And then the tested ones are effectively our separators. Yeah. Let's just ignore them for now, because I feel like what is that? Syntax kind, single line comment token, and multiline comment token. The reason being that you can't really treat them as normal tokens, because of the end of line thing for single line comments. We could probably treat the other one as a separator though. Let's test this. Right, this might work. Or not, for that matter. Yeah, that's a good point. You can't. This is not a dynamic token. It was supposed to be a separator token. That would explain why nothing works here. Yeah, I don't think this worked. So what's the problem now? So if we have else, interesting. That I think points to a generally bug in our Alexa now, because this should clearly work, right? I should be able to say else test 1, 2, 3, right? Oh, I'm an idiot. Read multiline comment. We need to also say it's a multiline comment. It's always good to have tests for stuff like that. All right. Yes, so that's clearly also an issue in our pairing. We can also not put a slash token after a single line comment, before a single line comment, or in front of a multi-line comment, right? That also doesn't work. Yeah, I guess it will not fix our tests now because yes. Okay, so that's where our tests are a little bit more complicated than we wish there would be. So our pairing logic here needs probably some refinement here. Yeah, we probably have to now say unless if require separator for T1 kind and S kind, or I guess and in this case, and we don't require a separator. So when the separator itself collides effectively, then we have to be careful, right? S kind, T2 kind, right? Let's see what happens now. Nice. All right. Clearly we need to do that. And now we can say, let's add this guy here. And then add test coverage for comments. Alrighty, so that's nice. So I feel like for trivia today, I might not have enough time to actually do trivia entirely. But let me think about what we can do. So the thing is, I think once we have support for trivia, I can change this code here. So in a sense, what we're doing here right now is a bit weird, right? Ideally, we would just, instead of doing tokenization, we would parse the entire thing as a syntax tree, right? And once we have that, we can, instead of doing this stuff here, we would effectively go over the entire syntax tree and would effectively traverse the trivia that is in the syntax tree and the tokens, or the tokens with their trivia. That would make this logic here slightly more complicated, but it's slightly cleaner because now, you know, think of things like contextual keywords, like C#, for example. You know, think of partial, right? Partial is a keyword when it's followed by the word class, otherwise it's not. So this sort of rendering only works when you actually parse the whole thing and not just tokenize the whole thing. And that would be nice for us to do. But for now, let me just clean up some stuff here. So, oopsie daisy. So I don't like this one here. So let's at least have some methods on syntax facts. That centralizes this, right? We already have some stuff here for precedences, keyword kind. Public static bool is keyword. So we can just preserve this for now here. Ideally this would be a switch statement, but then you have to be careful that we always update this. Which for the time being, I don't feel like it. So we just say keyword is keyword now. That seems reasonable. I guess. That seems more reasonable, and then we can just say if it's a token. So what about this? All right, only one place as well. Okay, that's nice. I think that makes sense. All right, now let's do this. Add helper methods to determine whether something is a keyword or a token. All right, so now let's actually go to our Alexa and talk about how we would do trivia. So basically the idea is that we change our token representation, right? So our token representation, let's go to our token. So our token currently has these things on it. So what this would look like is that we add leading and trailing trivia. So unfortunately that causes some churn, which I don't think I have time to actually accommodate, because basically there's various things we need to do. I'm now thinking of ways I can do part of the work. Well, can certainly do one thing, which is going to our token, oopsie, syntax kind, and we can certainly say whitespace trivia, oopsie, can at least rename these guys, trivia, trivia, trivia. Save all. Then we can go here. I can add a new method called is trivia. And then we can just say switch kind. And we could say syntax kind, whitespace, trivia. Single line comment, multi-line comment. Right? That seems reasonable. Yeah, the one thing we want to use this is in our parser. So instead of doing all of this, we can just say is trivia. If it's not trivia and not a bad token. Should we say bad token is also bad token trivia? Maybe. Yeah, I guess. So if it is okay, so we can probably remove that now here, because we can just say this is kind is trivia. So if it's not trivia, And it's either a keyword or ends with token. Something like that. Let's see what our tests say. You wrote token instead of token with a capital T. Where did I mess that up? Was it the previous commit? Oh yes. Thank you. I'm curious now. Did we mess up our tests? So the number certainly looks familiar, which makes me believe that that is correct. But let me stash what I currently have, and so probably when I run now, I probably have fewer tests because we no longer find all the tokens. No, but nonetheless. Yes, all right. So let's do that, and now let's pop the stash. And now I get a merge conflict probably for this guy here, which is fine because we want this one anyway. All right, so that seems reasonable. And then we can probably, yeah, let's simplify this a little bit here. So if it's trivia, if it's not trivia, then we add it. Let's see what we've done so far. Okay, we remove this one. Call this bad token trivia. White space trivia, multiline common trivia. Yeah, so one thing we should also fix, come to think of it. Yeah, let's just commit this and call this rename or introduce trivia, but only in naming. And now let me do one more thing, git rebase master. Oopsie. So let me edit this one here, because I just realized one thing, which is if you go now to our syntax highlighter, which it would be in Minsk REPL. What is that? Render line. We're saying is comment here, but we only check for single line comment. So we really should be saying syntax. So token kind is comment. Let's put it here. Public static bool is comment. This syntax kind, and that would be return. Kind is syntax kind single line comment, or kind is syntax kind multiline comment token. So I'm standing on you're currently editing a commit. Yeah, but which one I'm on? Really? Yeah, that's the right one. So let me fix that. And now let's rebase continue. Okay, we have a merge conflict. That is fine. We take this one anyway. But it won't build now, because we didn't rename the newly introduced method now. Alright, yeah. That's fine. Not this one. Facts. Nope, not this one either. That's the one. That would be trivia. So this should work now. It annoys me just a little bit every time I see the repeated message that you are using a preview. I understand it, I just don't like it. How do I say this nicely? Personally, I hate it. And the reason being that if it would be a single line, I would be much more inclined to like it probably. But the fact that we print it per project, not a fan. Not a fan. But yeah. Well, it is important to know that you're doing a preview. But yes, I don't think the way we emit it right now is the best possible way either. All right, so this is moderately clean. I know we have at least the ability to do single line and multi-line comments. And then as far as trivia goes, I think I will spend another episode to just literally do the work in order to have that in the right places. So let me give you a few examples of why I didn't pursue this today. And by the way, I have a meeting at 10, so I have to wrap it up now. But basically, the reason why there is some work involved here is if we go to our syntax token, there's a few things we need to do. First, we need to introduce a new type called syntax trivia, which will not be a syntax node. It will be a leaf node that is just data that we attach to the syntax token. It will have a containing token as its parent. It will have a kind, a position, and a text probably. And then what we will do is we will add a leading and trailing trivia collection on the node, on the token. And then basically in the lexer, it's not super hard in the lexer, because basically the way that works is every time we say lex, we basically at the beginning say, okay, well, basically we remove this. We basically take all the code here, move it into a separate method called readToken. And then lex basically does, okay, lex leading trivia, readToken, lex trailing trivia. And then you create a token that basically has the leading and trailing trivia in it. So that's the easy part. Now what's interesting is that now we want to also change the way our syntax nodes work, because our syntax nodes right now have this thing called span. So span right now is effectively the entire span in the input, not including trivia, right? But when you want to walk the whole tree, so in other words, okay, let me give another example. When you have like something like this, right? Some comment, right? The span for the declaration of this type here starts here, because that's where the first token is. However, this first token contains trivia, right? And the trivia is all of this white space here, this line break here, this comment, all of this trivia. So that's basically the entire span, including the trivia. And so the way Roslyn models that is, it says span is effectively just the token itself, excluding trivia. And then it has another property called full span, which also includes all the trivia in the span. And so the reason we want to have both span and full span is so that when you, for example, walk the syntax tree in order to do syntax highlighting, well, then you have to check the full span, not just the span, because otherwise you miss all the comments and all the other stuff, right? And so we have to make sure that we expose both of them and then also, correctly compute them, which again is not hard, right? You just say effectively the exact same thing you do here. You just say full span rather than span. And then our token, of course, overrides span to just return its span, and it overrides full span to also include the first and last leading trivia. Sorry, the first leading trivia and the last trailing trivia. And then we also have to change the way our syntax highlighter works to honor that. It will probably not take us 2 hours. It probably takes us, something between 45 minutes to an hour to do that. But that's kind of the amount of work that we have to do. And then effectively that's it. I think then we have trivia properly stored in the syntax tree. Once we have that, I think there's other interesting stuff we can do. For example, our parser right now, if we go to the parser here, I don't think there's any case where we skip today. Is there any example where we actually skip tokens? Yes, here. If parse member did not consume any tokens, we need to skip the current token and continue in order to avoid an infinite loop. We don't need to report an error because we already tried to parse an expression statement and reported one. So here's an example where if we do that, we just drop the token on the floor because the resulting syntax tree will not contain the token. And so what we would do instead is we would effectively, when we skip a token, we would modify the next token and add that token as trivia to that token. And this way the thing is contained. Now, of course, the syntax kind for this thing would not be the token kind. It would be something like, skip token trivia or something. But now the question is, where does the token actually go? And so Roslyn has this concept of structured trivia, where trivia is not just a kind and some text. It actually has a syntax node or an optional syntax node property where you can stash arbitrary data into that. And so this way you can actually have, substructures inside of the trivia as well. And we might do that as well, so we make sure that when we syntax highlight skip tokens, they also get printed out. Otherwise, bad things will happen if we use the syntax tree to do syntax highlighting. Hey, you're using a preview. Hey, you're using a preview. I'm thinking of this grill. Hey. Newbie question, what's a rebase? Oh man, if you've never heard of rebase, that is probably the worst, like a much worse debate than what is tabs versus spaces. So rebasing in Git speech is effectively just the ability to change your commit history. And as you can imagine, that is super controversial, right? Some people like it, some people hate it. I personally love it. The problem with rewriting history is that everybody who already has your changes is now fucked over because you effectively changed the structure. And so when they already have your commits and they pull your changes again, then basically the SHA-1s or the commit IDs no longer align, and then bad things happen. So the way I use rebase is I use rebase in my feature branches, or as they're often called, topic branches, right? Usually you work in a branch, you do all your stuff, then you submit a PR with your changes against master or whatever the branches you want to merge in. And in my case, the way I see it is I usually will do the following. I usually will push commits as I see fit, usually in order, right? I do my code review. Then I will usually get a bunch of code review feedback. Usually what I do is I will push all changes as they come in. So I will have address Paul's code review feedback, address Mike's code review feedback. So they had individual commits with their name. So they also have an easy way to review what I changed in order to accommodate them. And then once everybody is happy, then I will rebase my branch and clean it up. And so I will, change things in a way that it makes sense after it's being merged. I usually don't squash merge my commits on GitHub because then you literally, collapse every commit into a single commit, which is also not what you want for the most part. So I usually try to have, commits that make sense. But the problem is the way it makes sense is usually a hindsight thing, right? Like as you're developing it, you don't know what makes sense yet. As you saw earlier, like I made a bunch of mistakes, but I personally believe that there's not a lot of value in showcasing these mistakes after the fact, right? I think there's value in taking a code base from point A to point B in a structured way. So first we add single line comments, then multi-line comments, then we rename stuff to trivia. Those are logical steps in the process of doing the work. Me fucking things up and then having to go back and add methods somewhere, nobody cares, right? That's not relevant. That's just an artifact of how I work. And so the way I use rebase is I try to preserve my logical steps, but I try to remove the noise. Right, that's the way to think about it. Interactive rebase in Git is just a way you have a text file, you can shuffle commits around, you can remove commits, you can edit commits, you can change wording in the commits, and all of that. That's basically what a rebase is. Structured trivia, not trivial trivia. Very true. Very true. Yeah, 70% of the feedback will be typos and spelling mistakes. Exactly. Who cares? Have you ever opened a Git log to say, I wonder how many typos Immo has made? The answer is close to infinite, right? That's a given. Is it better than another merge? Well, a merge is effectively a permanent record in your history, right? And so if your goal is to remove noise, adding more merges to your code base is not going to help. Right? Think of a rebase literally as rewriting history, right? You're changing the commits, the order of commits, the number of commits, right? That's what it is. A merge is just taking another history and pushing it on top of another history and then adding a merge node in between, right? yeah, personal preference is the way to think about it, right? Some projects ban rebases entirely because people can't handle the complexity. In the way our .NET Core repos work, a lot of repos do squash merges, which, as I said, I'm not a fan of. But by and large, people have the policy that we never ever rebase shared branches. So there's no rebase of the master branch, right? Like that's a no-no, because then you screw over the entire team and you change your commit history in master and then force push, right? So we actually use GitHub to disable force pushes for shared branches like master and, obviously release branches. Topic branches, which people use to submit PRs, they can do whatever the heck they want. Like nobody cares. Those projects are weak. Projects that ban rebases. Well, I mean, yes and no. I mean, I don't know how much experience you have with explaining Git to people. I mean, I've had various team environments over the years, and I love Git, but I also would say that even within Microsoft, when we introduced Git to the larger team, there were a lot of people that had trouble with Git. And Git is kind of like a thing when you don't know what to do. It is very easy to do something dumb and then not being able to recover because it's some complexity. If you understand Git well, if you understand that it's all just a giant DAG, right, and it's all just operations over that DAG, and you can visualize it, you can always unfuck a situation, right? I've went to coworkers' machines, I had no idea what they did, and then they said, oh, something doesn't work, and then 20 minutes later, I had their branch recovered to the point where they wanted it. But it's certainly not easy to do, right? If you're a beginner, like it's very confusing. And rebases in a team environment can be very detrimental if you configured your shared repo in a way where people can rewrite master, right? And then bad things happen. And recovering then when 20 people make mistakes, that gets really complicated very quickly. So I have some sympathy for projects that just say, you know what, we're all beginners right now, so we just constrain what we allow our people to do to not have a complete mess. You can always unfuck the things. Yes, that is very true. All right. So I think that's it for today. I think next Wednesday we will stream again, and then next Wednesday I will tackle trivia for real, right? Today we only did the comment section of it. I should probably have it associated my... You know what? Yeah, we'll probably put it in the PR description. Anyway, so yeah, the other thing I will do until Wednesday is we now have 3 episode branches that I haven't merged yet. As I said, it's a bit of feature creep. So I will do the notes over the weekend, and then I will merge them in order so that our history also kind of makes sense for master. And then so by the time Wednesday starts, hopefully we have everything merged and everything ready to go. All right, guys, thanks a lot for tuning in, and then I hope I see you guys next week. Bye-bye.